Probably if you are familiar with the armored vehicles of the Second World War, and specifically with the Germans, you will remember having seen many armored vehicles with side plates of spaced armor, and you may have wondered what these plates were for. You probably think they were created to protect German tanks from high-explosive anti-tank projectiles, like those fired by bazookas or by clowns, but this was really not the case. Well, clearly they were used to protect the tanks, but exactly to protect them from what, and the most curious of all, is that despite the fact that they were very good, why were these spaced armor plates only used by the Germans? And why do so many experts claim that these plates were really harmful to the German tanks? If you are a big fan of this channel, you may know part of the answers to these questions, but as always on this channel, there is always much more to know. And definitely this is the case. The story of these spaced armors begins at the end of 1941 in the middle of Operation Barbarossa, in the battles of Germany against the Union Soviet. The Germans made use of blitzkrieg tactics, as was customary, where the extensive use of armored vehicles was very necessary. The problem was that the Western enemies that Germany had faced by that time really did not have an effective way for the infantry to face the German tanks, at least not as effective as the methods the Soviet Union had. The Soviet infantry had many measures to defeat German tanks. One of them, and the most proven, were their powerful 14.5mm anti-material rifles, which were literally capable of penetrating the side armor of almost all German tanks. Really, this was not such a prominent problem, since the penetration of a 14.5mm projectile did not always result in fatalities within the crew. But shots in the tracks, in engine areas, or in crew members were often able to stop the tanks in the middle of battle. The German High Command was concerned about the growing number of tanks being decommissioned. By anti-material rifles gave orders to German engineers to find a solution. Already by the end of 1942, the engineers were experimenting with the Schutzadekorn, and this meant protective cover, or as it was more commonly called, Schossen. The Germans experimented by shooting Soviet PRTD rifles of 14.5mm at 100 meters at a 90-degree angle. That is the ideal situation for a PRTD user. Experiments were conducted with 30mm armor plates with spaced Schossen armor, and in 90% of the cases, the 14.5mm projectile could not penetrate the armor. The Schossen plates had the ability to deform the projectile in the air or directly cause it to hit at a bad angle on the main armor, preventing it from penetrating the armor. Experiments were also done with lighter steel meshes that had less impact on tank suspension. By the war's end, Germans started using metal meshes for various reasons, which will be discussed later. Returning again to the story, in February of 1943, the application of the Schossung on German armored vehicles was seriously discussed, and the initiative was approved by Hitler himself in March of that same year. It was applied to all armored vehicles that needed it. In just a month, the Stüge 3 Panzer III and IV already had the Schossung equipped and ready to use in battle. They were placed on the sides of the tank hull and on the sides and rear of the turret, as these represented the most vulnerable and least armored parts of the tanks. The system was quite simple. It consisted of adding 5mm metal plates. In armored vehicles with less armor, they could be up to 8mm. That is, these plates were generally of little thickness, but they still had a considerable weight. They were kept away from the tank by some fasteners and often covered the tank almost to its total height. Something I didn't mention about the Schossen is that it was partially effective against anti-tank projectiles that were around 40mm, which was quite advantageous. In fact, these projectiles were a big problem for the Schossen plates, because if these projectiles did not penetrate the main armor, they damaged the tank's Schossen. That's why it was made modular, so that in case it was damaged, it could be repaired without taking down all the modules. In the Panthers, their plates were of lesser extent since they were better armored. They didn't need it too much. Even the Herzer tank destroyers also used some small protective skirts, but probably the armored vehicles that used the Schossen in the most characteristic way were the Stug 3, which covered the entire side of these, providing them with great protection as they were the most vulnerable to anti-tank rifle projectiles, and these showed off this attachment in the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943. Even as at that time Germany was concerned that the Soviets would use anti-tank mines like the Panzerknacker mines, which could be used by the infantry and were very good, which won without merit to the Schossen plates. Basically, the without merit, to summarize, was a coating that prevented grenades from sticking to the tanks. It was a paste to which rough shapes were given because the Schossen had Simerit. We've already discussed Simerit on the channel. I suggest watching that video. In 1943, the Germans developed the Panzerfaust and discovered that the Schossung was equally effective to counter hollow kinetic energy charges like those fired by clowns from bazookas, so they didn't have to change anything in the protection of the tanks when they had to face these same ones. However, as happened with the Simerit, many experts claim that the problem of the HIT charges present in the Allied armies was not so important. So as happened with the Simerit, the Schutzadekorn was actually also in the long run a great loss of money that further complicated the manufacture of the tanks. Only the Soviets used anti-material rifles, and in the West, the presence of bazookas was not so important. In addition, to stop a HIT projectile, a thick 8mm armor plate was not necessary. A simple mesh was enough. In fact, towards the end stages of the conflict, the Germans on the Western Front replaced the Schossung with simple steel meshes that were much lighter and easier to produce, and definitely stopped the HIT charges in the same way as the Schossung did. The frozen ones had more to fear from the HIT hollow charge explosives, since they were considerably more common in the Axis armies. Commonly, Allied tanks were covered with concrete, surrounded by logs, sandbags, and other improvised armors, as we saw in the video of improvised armors that I also recommend. 2, of course, try to dodge German anti-tank weapons, most of the time without much success, and also these practices always seriously affected the suspension of the tanks, much more than the short zone. The Panzerfaust and similar were responsible for creating a large part of the casualties of the Allied tanks. However, the Allies did not copy Schossung, and this is due to the production philosophy of each nation. For example, the Germans produced more complex and expensive tanks, but of higher quality, while the Americans were more efficient, prioritizing quantity over quality, but always maintaining a balance. Having the best tank is useless if you can only have a few, and this is somewhat understandable since the Americans had to supply armored vehicles to several nations, which was somewhat negligent if you think about it, because in the end it was the poor crews who had to suffer by adding improvised armor to try to protect their tanks from weapons they couldn't face. Or maybe the Americans simply didn't consider that at that point in the game. Adding spaced armor to their tanks was something useful. The debate on this still continues today. In contrast, the Soviets did understand a lot of the German philosophy and produced grills similar to those used by the Germans at the end of the conflict. And basically that would be all about the Schossung. Thank you very much for watching this video and excuse my poor pronunciation of German.